All right, welcome everyone to today's Google Webmaster Central Office Hours Hangouts. My name is John Mueller. I'm a Webmaster Trends Analyst at Google, usually from Switzerland, today from Mountain View with a bunch of guests that came over to join us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure.
Start over here.
Hey guys, I'm John Vantine. I'm Director of SEO at TrueCar here in San Francisco, and I'm stoked to be on the other side of the camera for once today.
Hi guys, my name is Chris, and I'm the Senior SEO Manager for Instapage in San Francisco, and I'm excited to be here for the Hangout.
Hello, my name is Massimo Paolini. I am the CEO of Spectrum Group Online. It's a digital marketing agency, and I'm very pleased to be here as well.
Hi, my name is Misha. I work at ZipRecruiter. We're a job site with millions of pages where employers can post jobs and job seekers can look for jobs, and I'm happy to be here as well.
And I'm Matthew Williams, and I work at Cloudflare, leading the charge in content and SEO.
Cool, fantastic. Nice mix of people. Most of you, I guess, are from San Francisco, came down?
Yeah.
Cool.
10 minutes away. About 20 minutes, Redwood City.
Okay, cool. All right, so maybe we can start, like, do any of you who are live here want to introduce yourselves as well? While we're introducing people?
Yeah, I can. Hello, I'm Nikola Minkov. I'm CEO at SEO agency Serpact from Bulgaria.
Wow.
We are a local SEO agency, and that's it.
Hello, and my name is Dillian, but shortly Dido. I'm the head of SEO of Serpact, a local agency here in Bulgaria. And wow, here it's 2 a.m. in the morning.
Yeah.
You guys are crazy.
We love SEO.
You know, SEO is our passion.
Hello, my name is Saidul. I am SEO manager of FieldClicks. FieldClicks is a Sydney online marketing agency. So I'm from Sydney.
Wow, cool. That's pretty far. What time is it in Sydney?
It is 11.
Oh, that's reasonable.
That's a segue to me. I'm in Adelaide, which means it's 10:45. So not quite as far. I'm an SEO consultant, and I also help out with the Google Webmaster forums, which John runs.
Cool. They're ahead of us in the future.
Hello, my name is Alexander. I'm a technical SEO at About You in Germany. Here it's 1 o'clock in the morning.
Crazy. I try to do them in European daytime too. So, okay, that's good. All right. Shall we start off with a question from one of you, maybe?
Sure. I mean, I guess mine might be a sort of a quicker, simple one, but I had a question that I think you've touched on in the past. Someone asked about file names for sitemaps, and you said the file name, or I think you said the file name shouldn't be that important or shouldn't matter. But we're seeing a situation now where we're generating sitemaps daily, over 1,000 individual XML sitemaps for this massive website. And the file names change every day because the date is included in the file name structure. So could that be problematic, since Googlebot may not even see all these file names every day? They might not know which ones they crawled, which ones they didn't, and we're moving it over to the next day. The sitemap index file references them each day, so Googlebot would know where to find these. But should we try and keep a static file name rather than having dynamic ones each day?
Yeah, I generally tend towards having a static sitemap file, or mostly so that individual URLs try to remain in the same sitemap files.
Okay.
So unless you're generating new content every day, that amount of new content, then I try to keep the same sitemap files.
Well, it's vehicle inventory, so it's highly ephemeral.
Okay. Well, if the URLs are changing every day, if you have new content every day, then of course you have to generate new sitemap files over time.
Right.
But if you have existing content in existing sitemap files, I try to keep those as stable as possible, just so that we can recrawl those sitemap files as quickly as possible to really kind of keep up with the changes, rather than like spending time crawling sitemap files that don't exist anymore.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
When you say content, do you mean the content on the pages themselves or the URLs and the sitemaps?
The URLs and sitemaps. Yeah.
Okay.
Good point. Yeah. Cool. All right.
All right. All right. I'll jump in.
Go for it.
So here's a question for you about CDNs in general. So there's this back and forth, like I mentioned before we started recording, about how with CDNs, some people go on and say, hey, Cloudflare is damaging my SEO because I've moved on to a CDN and now it has a shared IP address. Do CDNs in general damage SEO, or are there circumstances in which a CDN can be detrimental and should be avoided?
Good point. So from our point of view, we try to treat CDNs more as kind of a hosting platform. And in general, you can host your website wherever you want. So if you use this platform or that platform, that doesn't really matter for us. What does matter for us, though, is the amount that we can crawl from a kind of a hosting platform. And generally, when we see that a website shifts the hosting that they have to some other platform, we'll be a bit more conservative with how much we can crawl from there. So we'll usually kind of step back a bit and say, oh, we're not sure how much load this server setup will actually support. Especially if it's a bigger website that we've been crawling really hard. And we'll probably kind of like step back a bit, not crawl as hard, and then over the next couple of days or weeks, we'll kind of ramp that up again to what we think is a reasonable load for that server where we're not causing any problems. So that's one thing that sites sometimes see when they shift to a CDN or when they shift between different hosting platforms in general. But that's with regards to crawling. And crawling is, of course, kind of necessary that we can actually index the content. But if it's content that's already indexed, then we don't need to recrawl it all the time to actually show it in the search results. So it's not that your site would rank lower because you move to a CDN or because we're crawling slower. It's just we're trying to concentrate the crawling at the moment, and the URLs that we can pick up new, those are the ones that we can index, of course. And if there are things that we can't get to because the website is so big and we're not sure how much we can actually crawl from the website, then that's something where you might see anything. But that's totally temporary. And that's also something where if you have a really large and dynamic website where you start seeing this when you move to a CDN or a different hosting platform, there's a form in the Help Center that you can fill out. It's, I think, report a problem with Googlebot, where you can say, well, I moved to a new infrastructure. You can crawl me with, I don't know, 10 QPS. And then the Googlebot engineers will take that and say, OK, we'll like twist the dial here and kind of make this catch up a little bit faster.
Got it. That's great information. Yeah.
And you can do that the other way too. If we're crawling way too much and I don't know, your hosting platform is set up in a way that it just provides all this capacity and you just have to pay for it, and you're like, oh, wait, Google is like killing my wallet. Then you can also go there and say, hey, I need you guys to crawl a lot less. And what really helps is if you give us concrete numbers and you say, this is what I'm OK with, rather than just saying, well, you're crawling too much or you're not crawling enough, because then the engineer's like, OK, maybe like 10% more, or like 100% more. Like, what do you want?
Great.
John, on a related question, if, say, your image is on a CDN and the CDN is a separate domain to your own domain, would that have a negative on the association of the images with your own domain or anything like that?
No, that should be completely fine. So that's something, if you've had it set up like that, that's the way it is. That's something that I think makes a lot of sense for websites that have big images or big files, big static files in general, to put those on a CDN where you can serve kind of the static content a lot faster. The only tricky part is migrating to a setup like that. So if you have images on your own domain and you want to migrate them to a CDN, to a different subdomain or a different domain completely, then since images tend to be recrawled a lot less frequently, it can take a bit of time for that actually to happen. So that's one thing with images that's a little bit different than with web content, in that we crawl images a lot less frequently than web content. And for images, we always need the image and the landing page to be indexed. So that can happen, like if you shift to a CDN or shift to a different host name for all of this content, that it takes a certain amount of time to actually catch up. But afterwards, that's totally fine to have it set up like that. So it's, yeah, I think that's a good thing. All right, so I'm trying to get the questions that were submitted working. I think I'm close, but maybe we'll just take some more questions from you all until we got that set up.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about the upcoming mobile first indexing and mobile speed update that Google just announced. So we're undertaking a big migration right now to new stack, and we're wondering which technologies we should be adopting that would help us on mobile rankings and indexing. And specifically, we're looking into AMP and PWA. So my more specific question is, like, do those affect indexing and ranking in the Google's mobile algorithm?
Yeah, that's a complicated set of questions in like a few words. So in general, when it comes to mobile-first indexing, what helps us a lot is if you have a responsive design where you have one URL which serves the same content. Because then when we shift to the mobile-first index, where we index the mobile version or the version that mobile phones would see, then nothing really changes. Responsive design is the same HTML, same URLs. You don't have to change any of the links. You don't have to worry about rel canonical, hreflang, all of those cross links. They all just continue working. So that's kind of, I think, one setup that I'd recommend. If you currently have separate mobile URLs, then that's one direction I'd certainly head. You could potentially take that a step further and say, I will move completely to AMP, for example, and say my mobile version is actually an AMP page. And that's something that we've seen some sites do. You can do that on a per-page basis, too. So you can say, well, the mobile version for this part of my website is on AMP, and other templates are normal HTML. When you have it set up like that, then you have all of the advantages of kind of this inherently fast platform with AMP. Also with the caching that's available, like if it's on AMP, that's an option there. If you have AMP set up separately to your normal website, then of course you have those two URLs that we have to crawl and we have to index and recognize that they're connected. So that's,
sorry, quick question about that. So for the speed component, if you had AMP as your canonical page, would the speed be based just off of the AMP page then? If
AMP is canonical, then everything is based on the AMP page. So that's one option to kind of look into to see maybe that makes sense.
And if it's not, so if we have like
if you have a
regular page and then an AMP.
Yeah, with the regular page and the AMP page, what happens there is we index the regular page as the indexable content, and we use the whatever mobile version users would see, which would probably be the AMP version as a basis for the speed. So that's one thing where, of course, AMP pages often are very fast by default. You can make slower AMP pages. You can make fast non-AMP pages. So it's not that you need to be on AMP to kind of have the speed effect, but it's an option there. PWA, I think, is taking things to a completely another level. It's not something where I'd say you have kind of a small tweak in that the HTML is just in a different format, but rather often you have a completely different setup, which is a JavaScript-based framework that provides all of the functionality of PWAs. But that also means that there's a lot more complexity involved when it comes to kind of having an indexable site, where you have to think about, does Googlebot need to actually render the JavaScript? Do I need other search engines to render the JavaScript? Do I need maybe a pre-rendered version for some kind of services and other versions use the rendered version? It's something where there's a lot more complexity involved. So that's something where if you have an engineering team that can deal with this kind of complexity from JavaScript side, then that's definitely an option to make a really fast site. But it's not like at the same order of magnitude when it comes to work as AMP, where you might say, well, I'll just change my HTML templates to AMP and it'll just work. With a PWA, there's a lot more complexity involved.
Would you say going into 2018 and major trends in SEO, would you say that AMP is one of the more important things that most sites should be focused on if they have limited resources and they want to focus on improving one particular area?
You can. I think that's definitely an option. The nice thing about AMP is that it's a really fast framework. So it's something that offers a lot of kind of fancy optimizations by default with like the lazy loading stuff, with all of the caching that's enabled, the embeddability. It offers a lot of really neat functionality that you can kind of work with. You can, of course, do all of that yourself with your own framework. You can set something up yourself, but sometimes it's a bit harder. So I think there are a lot of opportunities there. It's not that you need to do AMP in order to be visible in search. You can do anything to be visible in search, but it's a really fast framework. There are lots of people working on that to expand that at the moment. So I think that's probably one way where you can get a lot of value for little effort.
One follow-up question about PWA. So is the crawler like looking to see if a page meets all the requirements for PWA, or is it more just should we be thinking about the different components and how they help things like site speed and other factors?
Yeah, it's not that we would treat a PWA differently, at least at the moment. We'd say, oh, this is a PWA where we'll do these things. It's more PWA has a set of functionality that they use to define that it's actually a PWA. And that's more kind of like almost like, I guess, a branding of those functionalities. And from a crawling and indexing point of view, we basically just look at that and say, oh, it's a JavaScript-based site, and we need to use rendering to view the content. So we'll do that like we would with any other JavaScript framework.
Okay.
Hey, John, could you touch on dynamic serving? We basically optimized our site and cut off about 200 to 300K using dynamic serving versus responsive. But obviously, Google says they prefer responsive. So do we go back and then make it responsive, or should we stick with what we've done?
I think if you set up dynamic serving properly, that's fine as well. What is important for us, which I suspect some sites have done differently in the past, is that all of the kind of metadata and everything is available on the mobile version as well. So if you're using dynamic serving and you're stripping the page down into something that's like purely the text and the CSS that's required to render on a mobile phone, then things like structured data might have been stripped out. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing just to kind of be aware of. With a responsive design, you don't have to worry about that because it's like all the same thing. But with dynamic serving, you kind of need to test for that and use the mobile version to test for the structured data, to test that the images are all in there, the videos are properly embedded, all of that as well.
Okay. Yeah, I got it. And on that too, do you think, and maybe this is more of a CDN question, but if we have two versions, kind of, then the cache only gets hit if they access mobile or they access desktop versus responsive, where either when they hit it, I'll cache it. Do you think that impacts load time or rankings from load time in that way?
I don't know. You'd have to test it.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure that the common CDNs, they can deal with the usual dynamic serving setups, right?
Yeah, I mean, the big key is, right, the more you can cache, the better. The more you don't have to go back to the origin to fulfill the request, the faster your response rate. And that's going to affect you different amounts based on how large the file sizes are.
Cool,
John?
Yes.
I have a question. if we have faster mobile responsive version of our website, do we need AMP version for our website?
Do you need an AMP version? You don't need an AMP version. So it's not that it's a requirement or anything, but it's a way of having a really fast page. So kind of the setup is really useful. But AMP is also a lot more than just a fast page. It's kind of allowing this embeddability that makes it possible for us to pre-render the pages when people come from search, so that when they click on your result, it's already loaded, it's already available. And similarly, that apps like, I believe Twitter, for example, they also use AMP pages, and they cache them as well, that they're able to pull in this content quite a lot faster than if it's just a fast mobile page. So AMP is on kind of the most visible part is definitely the speed aspect, but there's a lot more than just speed when it comes to AMP.
If there anything like this, the AMP version is only important for the blog type of website, or is it for all type of website? Like for e-commerce website, if we have product page with a lot of images, should we create a AMP page for those pages, or we only focus on the blog post-created pages?
You can do AMP on a per-page basis. So even if you have different parts of your website that have different suitability for AMP, I'd say you could still use AMP on some pages and maybe not use it on others. So that's one thing to keep in mind. It's not that you have to invest and say, I will switch everything to AMP or nothing to AMP. You can try it out and see what works, what doesn't work. There are a lot of things being done, especially for e-commerce, with regards to AMP. So I suspect that maybe in the beginning it was very easily suitable for blog or kind of new static content, but there are lots of kind of other options that are coming out that are making things really, really interesting for AMP as well. So if at the moment you're looking at it and you're like, I need this functionality and it's not available, then maybe it's worth either submitting an issue to GitHub and say, I need this, and then I can switch to AMP, or maybe just wait a couple of months and see what has been happening there. I know the folks that are working on AMP, it's an open source project, they're moving extremely quickly. So looking across different teams at Google, they're like one of the groups that are really like moving high speed, adding lots of functionality, and making sure that this is useful for everyone.
Okay. And one more question. When we create AMP page for a website, the AMP page has separate URL. Both have the same content, but it always have the separate URL, like with domain name /AMP, like something like that. So do we need to create separate sitemap for AMP page, or we can put it with the same sitemap?
You can put it with the same sitemap file. That's perfectly fine. Yeah.
Can I ask another question? I had a question about pagination. I know that Google has guidelines for SEO-friendly pagination and the relationship between canonicals, indicating the relationship between all these pages in the series. But if we see a lot of pages deep in the paginated series being indexed and sometimes receiving search traffic, I've seen some sites, like I know Reddit has no-follow links placed on the pages deeper, right? So page 1, Google can crawl. They don't let them in the subsequent pages. Would you say there's an advantage to doing it one way over the other? Do you think it's best to let Google decide and sometimes send someone to page 100 of a product listings? Or do you think it's best to maybe cut it off and just focus your authority on that first page in the series?
I don't know. I haven't looked into the details of where we do it like this and where we do it like that. Mm-hmm. I think offhand, I try to treat that as something that depends on the website. Okay. In the sense that a lot of sites will have different categories, but actually the content itself will be available on multiple places. Mm-hmm. So if you have, I don't know, a shoe store, then maybe you have, like under men's shoes, you have this really long list, but actually they're also listed under running shoes or under these kind of shoes or blue shoes, red shoes, or whatever. And if you have all of those different categories, then we don't need to go to page 100 because we'll find links to all of the content maybe in the first couple of pages as well. So that kind of depends. With regards to sites that are more kind of news oriented, where there's like one long listing that lists everything, then that's something where, I don't know, maybe it depends. Maybe it makes sense to go deeper. Maybe it makes sense to kind of take that structure and say, okay, I'll create an archive section of my website and just link to it from there. That's a bit harder to say.
Okay.
Yeah, for us, one issue that we had when we did have paginated pages index is that, like, we have search results, and sometimes it's jobs, right? So sometimes they come in and out. And so page 10 would be indexed, and then 2 days later there is no page 10 because we don't have that many jobs
Same
for that
deal
particular job title. So then the user hits that page with nothing.
Right.
A 404 or whatever. So we decided to remove paginated pages.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, automotive is ephemeral in a similar way where inventory is coming and going. So same issue there.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how are you all using AMP? You tried it out?
We have it on our blog for now. We've been exploring search result pages, but haven't implemented that yet.
We use WordPress, so our site's on WordPress. We installed the WordPress AMP when it came out. I've had it since. It's improving all the time, and it happens automatically, so we have to do absolutely nothing.
Yeah, the plugin's great.
We're going to start playing with it, a little project, to see if we can tweak it and get more of our branding into it and whatnot. So we'll.
Okay.
I'd say we're susceptible to improvement on our AMP front. It's one of the things that we're dedicating a little bit more time to this year.
So you have AMP pages, but they're not that great yet?
So on the main marketing site, I don't think we have AMP pages. I think we have them on the blog as well. But it's one of those things that it's a matter of picking and choosing. And it sounds like this is a thing to pick.
Okay.
Yeah, for us, we have it on the blog. We tried it this summer for like our e-commerce type pages, which is like search results, listings pages, sort of like e-commerce. And we sort of hacked it together. So we actually saw those pages lost some traffic. And so we pulled it back, but we're going to try again, thinking that we're going to actually do it, full rollout this time. So we're doing it again.
Cool.
That's where we're at.
Yeah,
that's interesting you say that, because like at Instapage we have the AMP on blog. I mean the blog on AMP, and we've actually found some of the pages where the user metrics aren't as strong as it was on the mobile responsive page. Like the time on page is down and the bounce rate is higher. But obviously we feel like there's just no going back. You just have to go forward and just optimize as best for AMP. But are you seeing anything where there's some type of metrics where it could potentially be not as strong as before?
So for the most part, the issues I see there are that it's hard to track kind of the metrics when it comes to AMP, because depending on the way users go to those pages, it might be on a cache somewhere. It might be hitting like one set of analytics setups, and you compare that to analytics setup in a completely different way on the rest of the site. So it's really tricky to measure that properly. Also, when someone goes from a cached AMP page to your actual blog, like clicking around on other pages, like how do you track that? Is that a new visitor on the blog? Is that a bounce on the AMP page? What does that count like?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's I think that's one aspect that's a bit tricky, where in talking with people, they mention these things and they don't know themselves like what exactly is being tracked. And probably that's something that we can improve from the AMP side to try to find a way to create, I guess, more coherent metrics for these pages, regardless of where they're actually located and loaded. But I suspect that's not trivial to do.
Right.
That would be super useful, just for the record.
Yeah. I've heard of early adopters that removed AMP and then realized subsequently that they weren't tracking it properly. It's like maybe it was more effective than we thought it was. So
yeah, that could be us.
Yeah.
And talking about AMP, will the new Google Search Console include the ability to filter pages by AMP?
I don't know. Should it?
That would be.
What would you like to see there?
Well, so when I look at SEO results, I look at pages more than keywords. I look at a page, how's that page doing? Then I look at what's on the page, what is Google matching to it. And here I'm seeing that there are several AMP pages being served and how they're performing. If I wanted to only look at that, that would be how I use the filter. Here's all of my AMP pages, how they're performing, how are they, then I could see my data aggregated for AMP. So how is the position of those pages changing and whatnot.
Okay. That sounds interesting. Yeah, I don't know what the plans are there. So
Okay.
in Search Console, there's the feedback link, and the team is actively following pretty much everything that's submitted there and tracking that. So if there's something that you'd like to have in the new Search Console, make sure you submit it there.
Good to know.
Also, if there are things that you really like in there, it's like they're always happy to hear that too.
That's good to know.
So I have two more generic questions.
Okay.
One of them is directly related to WordPress. Is there a difference to Google between a page and a post?
No.
Didn't think so. Okay. So even the category, I mean, I've had people argue with me about the category and the fact that it can have tags and all of that. Okay.
No.
Perfect. The last question has to do with updating a content on a blog or on a page. I feel that if we update the date to the current one because we made changes, it's misleading because it doesn't have the original date of when the article was published. Yet, if we update it with current information, that date doesn't reflect that. So what's the best practice?
I think that really depends on what you'd like to do. So I know that's sometimes tricky in the sense that sometimes you just have one date on a page, and Google has to figure out what that date means.
Right.
But for the most part, we try to figure out like what the significance of this date is, and does it make sense to show it to the user? Does it make sense to treat this as new content or updated content, or should we just like see it as a date that was updated?
So when I was looking at some results attached to a page specifically, and another wish list for the Search Console is the ability to open a page directly from it. I found a trick around it. I found a workaround, but so I'm sorry, that was my train of thought. Oh yeah. So when we looked at the page and the results, our result was in the middle of the page, and I started looking at the sites up top. First of all, there's one site that had 3 listings on one page. Domain diversity not happening as much, or
that can happen. That makes sense.
Interesting. Okay. And all of those articles have newer dates than our article, which made sense. It's fresher content, therefore they would be up higher. So I don't know. That article, we do need to adjust it. We do need to refresh it. Should we change the date?
I think that's totally up to you.
Totally up to you.
Yeah. So I think the ranking of fresher content higher, that really depends on the query and what we think the user expects. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they're looking for reference material, and it doesn't make sense to just show something that's fresher. Sometimes they're looking for something new and updated, then maybe it does make sense to show that a little bit more. And kind of those expectations, they do change over time. So that's something you particularly see when some event happens in, I don't know, an earthquake in California. Like, hopefully not this week, but it can happen. Where people, when they search for California now, maybe they want the Wikipedia page that was written, I don't know, a couple of years ago, essentially. Right. But if they search for it after the earthquake, then they probably want the news. They want something new that's relevant to that event that recently happened. So these things, they definitely shift over time.
So dovetailing on that, so is it better than, because you want like updated content, let's say there's a DDoS attack, right? Then what is DDoS might not be as important as how are we dealing with this particular set of circumstances. Does Google then see the domain as generally more reputable around that topic if it seems to follow trends and is providing quality content in a particular direction as events unfold?
I suspect that can help, but it's not that we have kind of this, I don't know, concept of this domain is really awesome and we should kind of, I don't know, see it as something that's valuable in the future as well, but rather we try to look at it at a single point in time. So if you've been following the trends for the last 5 years and you suddenly stop, then that doesn't mean that your website is still relevant for something new that happens. but it's certainly something that collects value over time, kind of like you have a good website that people refer to all the time, then that does build a little bit of trust and kind of expectations from users as well. So I think that's a useful thing to do, but it's not the case that you can just say, well, I was really good for a couple of years, now I can just coast, and it'll still rank #1.
Right.
So in our case, we have these pages, like these search result pages where, again, it's jobs, so they come in and out all the time. And so the page is basically changing every few minutes, let's say. So we're not like trying to submit a new sitemap to Google every time, the list of jobs on the page changes. But sometimes we'll make changes to like the title tag, a meta description, or we'll make a change to the template itself. So is there a way to like sort of notify Google that, hey, this is like an actual significant change to the page rather than just one of these like regular content updates, if you will?
I would use a sitemap file for that. So the last modification date in the sitemap file, that's really useful for us, especially if you've been using that as a way to tell us about significant changes on a page. So that's really something that we pick up for crawling and trying to recognize like bigger changes on a site or on a per page basis. What's problematic for us with a sitemap file is if you tell us like every page has changed all the time. Like my website is hosted on with PHP, and it like the sidebar changes every time you pull up a new page. So therefore every page has changed every second. And we look at that and we're like, well, like if everything is new, nothing is new, and we can just ignore that completely. But if you give us reasonable information, say, well, this is something that actually changed, then that's useful to have.
So I guess in our case, when we do make a change, it's like across all the pages at once, So it'd be like, let's say hundreds of thousands of pages.
That's
like,
fine.
Let's say they move on to a new template or we make some big change, but it's on all of them.
Yeah.
That would still be okay.
That's fine, but just not like all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
So do you use priority as well? That attribute?
We don't use priority at all.
Okay. I didn't think so, but
yeah, we announced that in the beginning. We thought that might be useful to get some kind of input from the webmaster on what they think their pages are, which one of their pages are important. But it's something it's very tricky. It's like everything is important, or they take some plugin to actually provide the priority information, and then the plugin is like, well, these pages are like this, these pages are like that. And in that case, we can figure that out just as well as a plugin.
Okay.
So hasn't turned out to be as useful as we thought initially.
Right.
So not to change the subject completely, but internationalization. So we're at this position where we're now breaking into these international sites, like I mentioned before we start recording, right? Where we have cloudflare.co.uk or whatever these different sites are. And we want to make sure that as we localize, we have the right canonicalization factors so we don't damage our primary domain by siphoning off the page rank. Is there steps we can take? Are there best practices to implementing that globally?
I don't know. So the tricky part there is there are lots of things that you can do. So you can go to Help Center and has all of the information for localization, the hreflang, the geo-targeting setup. There are lots of options that you can do, but figuring out which ones of these are relevant in your case so that you just don't go overboard and say, I will do everything and make a version for every country in every language, because then you do run into that situation where you're like diluting yourself more than you're providing value in individual areas. So finding that balance is something that you almost have to do like intuitively almost to figure out like where can I really provide significant value in a niche that I haven't covered so far, which makes sense to kind of separate out. So if you're talking about the UK and the US, then maybe it makes sense to treat those as one version. Just say, well, this is English. It's like English content is fine for everyone. But maybe it's the case that UK users have very specific expectations with regards to CDN. Maybe, I don't know, with privacy or whatever kind of laws they have in the UK at the moment. Maybe they have different expectations than people in the US have. And then it does make sense to kind of separate that out.
What if you're like dealing with content duplication, where let's say you have like the Spanish version or you have a variety of different things, but you have images that are the same, right? You have some assets the same, and then you have 11 domains that are duplicating content. can that be penalized or seen as, flagged by Panda or something like that as superfluous, or is that generally understood that you'll have different languages and do some elements that are duplicated?
Usually that's fine, but it's again kind of the situation where you have to be careful that you're not diluting everything too much, especially if you're kind of taking content that was really strong in the US market in English, and you're like saying, okay, I'll make different versions of that for different countries also in English. Then suddenly kind of the value of your English content is kind of spread across all of these different versions. And if you were ranking in English in the US on the basis of one really strong page, then suddenly you have a bunch of pages that are not quite as strong anymore, and that might kind of shift things around that other people are able to rank instead of you. So that's something kind of to keep in mind. And usually what I'd recommend if people like at a conference or someone asks me, I'd recommend finding some consultant who has experience with this, because this is something that you don't do often. It's not something that you can easily tweak afterwards. So finding someone who has experience working with large international sites and kind of where it makes sense to kind of invest time in and where it makes sense to kind of step back and say, okay, maybe one version of, I don't know, German content is fine. We don't need to do it in different country versions. Finding that balance is something that's sometimes a bit tricky. And having someone who's done that before is really useful. All right, let me try to go through a few of the questions that were submitted so that they weren't submitted for nothing. Can Google understand arrows in PDFs to show useful information? So I looked at the screenshot that was there as well. And from our point of view, we try to extract the text from a PDF and use that for ranking of the PDF itself. But we don't kind of try to extract the kind of structure of where words are connected and what diagrams look like. So at most, we might pull that out as an image and say this is an image within the PDF, but it's not that we try to understand that this piece of text has an arrow pointing to another piece of text. We're a business with a number of different branches, and we use Schema Markup. When we look at similar companies who have marked up theirs, everyone's a slightly different. And even though they all seem to go through the testing tool, can they all be correct? Well, how does Google deal with this? I think it's something where you kind of have to look at the options that are available with schema.org markup and the options that we support for search, and to pick the ones that actually work for you. So sometimes there are different ways of doing the same thing. Sometimes there's schema.org markup that we kind of like accept, but we don't use it for anything within search. And obviously, the validation tool will say, oh, this is fine. But if we don't use it for search, then you're spending time doing things that don't really have an effect. So I'd recommend looking at the search developer documentation and picking from those types that are in there, which ones actually make sense for your individual pages.
When you say use, do you mean things that result in a rich result? Because isn't there some merit to marking up things that don't visually manifest in the search results?
Yeah, so there's definitely some value in providing schema.org or structured data in general for us to help us to better understand the pages.
Right.
But if you're limited with the amount of time that you have available, you don't just like take all of your pages and mark up all of the entities. You kind of have to focus on what actually provides value for you.
Interesting. Okay.
So that's one thing where like we don't mind if people mark up more on their pages than we actually show directly in the search results, but it's not the case that you will see like a real clear kind of reaction based on that.
Okay.
Some people try to look ahead and say, well, this markup might be really useful for voice-based assistants, for example. Mm-hmm. And they might say, well, I suspect Google will start using this kind of markup maybe next month, maybe in a half a year, and they'll start implementing that ahead of time. So I think that's something you could definitely kind of bet on these things, but it's kind of hit and miss. Maybe we will, maybe we won't.
Sure.
So if you have schema markup, is it one of those things where it generally can be an indicator of a site that's, assuming the markup is done correctly, is more optimized? Or is it generally just it's either going to help you appear in a rich snippet or not, and it's really sort of a moot point otherwise.
We don't use it as a quality factor. So it's not that we would say this site has schema markup, therefore it's a better site. But sometimes we can recognize entities better if you mark up entities on a page, which is kind of a more flexible type thing, where if someone gives a really long query to us and we recognize, oh, they're asking about this entity and not using exactly those words, and we know this other page is also about this entity, maybe doesn't use exactly the same words, then we can still match that. And that helps us to try to find more relevant results together. But the most visible effect is really just the rich results in the search results.
Yeah. John, one question from here.
All right, go for it.
Thanks. John, like example, we use AMP technology 1 year and more. For first time, we integrate AMP for our blog post, like all of you. But after 6 months, before 3-4 months ago, we tried to integrate AMP for our website. But the problem, not problem, but the normally AMP give us one swoop more, /AMP. We use WordPress. And after the great conference in München about AMP technology, we start to migrate our website to full basic AMP without /AMP. Now I have a question. We have a lot of index page with AMP /. Can we? What will be the best practice in this case, to redirect this AMP /, to the normal /, or to keep it?
I would redirect it. If you have a new version of that URL, then I would just redirect it.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, let me see what else we have here. Our e-commerce site has a YouTube channel showing our products. Would the Panda algorithm also look at this when taking into account and valuing our website as a whole? Usually, our quality algorithms try to focus on the site itself. So if you have a separate site, essentially, which could be like a YouTube channel, which could be a blog or a Twitter account, whatever, then we would treat those as separate entities. So just by having a good YouTube channel doesn't mean that your website will rank better. Of course, if you have your YouTube videos embedded in your website, then there's the availability of like the video snippets showing up, which are sometimes really useful. But it's not the case that we'd say these different silos that you have, because they're all there, that we would treat all of the website as something more valuable. Can you give any tips on how to rank for voice search without impacting desktop mobile rankings? How should we amend our content to cater for both? I don't know. I think it really depends on the website, and it's tricky still in the sense that it's very early days for voice search. So there are different things that we're trying to do. There are different things that users are trying to do to get information. One thing that I saw recently is we sent out a lot of emails to, I believe, sites that have podcasts and recipes, specifically to get them to verify within, I think, the Google Assistant setup. That might be something that makes sense if you have this type of content that we can show within, well, show or kind of provide, point users at within kind of the voice interactive model. Another thing that sometimes comes up are the featured snippets, where if we recognize that your pages have a good answer to a specific question that people have, then maybe we'll pull that out as a featured snippet on desktop and mobile, and maybe we'll use that as an answer on voice. So that might be another thing to kind of look into. But I think it's really very early, and it's hard to say how that will evolve. It might be that, like, at the moment, everyone's thinking about voice, but the final state is more that, well, there's this mixed mode interactive thing where you have a screen and voice, and maybe that's what will actually work out better.
Sure. And you use Schema to mark it up so that, for example, recipe works with Home, for example, Google Home.
I don't know how it actually works. So I know they emailed a bunch of sites that use the recipe markup, but I don't know how that actually works.
Was it a tweet maybe? I saw something last week saying about it, and there was also another one that talked about doing the same and prepping content for Google Home. So I'm going to look at it.
Yeah.
But you also don't need schema to get a rich result, right? So
Correct.
it's possible that these answers are coming from non-schema sites.
Yeah. I think for recipes, it makes sense to have the markup there because there's a lot of text around it sometimes, and getting the ingredients and kind of the preparation and the metrics around the recipe, like, I don't know, how many calories, how many servings, all of that, that makes sense to have in some kind of machine readable way. But I don't know how that ends up being used in practice. Part of the problem is in Switzerland, a lot of these things are not actually launched. So I have a Google Home at home. I have an Alexa at home, but it's very different than what you would probably see here.
Interesting. Because I had Google Home reading the recipe, and I used it, and it worked. So
okay, cool.
Hey John, a quick question.
All right.
So it's about the site navigation. How important is the site navigation for Google? In other words, I mean, more complicated and descriptive navigation, or something more user-centric and more simplified? How Google treats these two situations?
For us, we usually don't look into the usability as much, but rather kind of the crawlability for us. Is the more important part for us, because we need to be able to start one place in the website and actually reach the rest of the website in a reasonable way. So that means things like having links on the pages is really useful. So one pattern that we sometimes see, especially for reference sites, is that the navigation will be mostly through a search box, where it's like you can look up like a list of items, and the search box is actually how you find the individual articles. And obviously for us, that's terrible, because we don't know what to search for to find the content.
Yeah.
We don't have links to kind of click through. But if you have links on the pages, and you link between related pages, you have a kind of a category structure, then that makes it a lot easier for us to start anywhere on the website, kind of crawl out from there and reach the whole rest.
So on that note, in terms of URLs, something I brought up earlier, but like we're revisiting our URL structure, and we're kind of considering two options. One is more like a thematic URL structure where different templates are grouped in folders by theme. So let's say you have like nursing jobs, and there's like a search results page, and then a bunch of jobs are under the same folder. Or doing it more by templates, so that a certain kind of template type is under one folder structure, and then other template types are under another. The reason for that would be like they have sort of different user engagement metrics, like bounce rate and things like that. So it might make sense to kind of separate them so that it's easier for Google to measure each group of templates. What would you recommend there?
From our point of view, it doesn't matter. You can do it either way. That's really something where we try to see URLs primarily as an identifier, and at most we might want to recognize patterns that are tricky to crawl. So if we recognize there's an infinite crawl space under this, I don't know, subdirectory or kind of sub-pattern, then that's something we'd want to watch out for. But that's more kind of from a technical point of view and less from a quality point of view. So if you have a structure that works well for you, that's what I'd use. From personal point of view, I try to see it more as something as what do I want to measure, and how do I need to have a structure that allows me to measure that. So if you're trying to separate things out by theme, and having it in different URL structure by theme makes sense for you to kind of compare the performance of these different types of jobs, then that might make sense. Whereas if you just have in I don't know, extreme case, you just have a hash as the URL, then obviously you can't use analytics and say, well, everything that has like starts with this is like compared to other ones. That's a lot harder.
We could use content groups in analytics.
Possibly, I don't know. I don't know analytics that well, but
Content grouping would allow you to do it.
Yeah, but it's something where I'd look more at other issues rather than SEO. So That might be like tracking, that might be usability, that might be whatever makes more sense from the infrastructure point of view.
So if we think of URL structures like trees, is there a notion that the stuff towards the at the bottom of the tree strengthens the stuff at the top just based on the URL structure?
Not really. Not really. No. No.
All right, thanks.
No.
John, I sometimes get people confusing the URL structure with the navigation. So you get questions like, is the folder structure important? My answer is typically no. Would that be right? That you don't really care about folder structures?
Yeah, yeah. So for crawling, indexing, ranking, it really doesn't matter. But again, sometimes you care about the folder structure and need to have it in a different way so that you can measure things or track things or whatever.
Would that also be true for an e-commerce shop where you have things organized in folders like trousers, short trousers, something like that?
Yeah, that usually works fairly well there too. The main thing that, especially with e-commerce sites, that I kind of watch out for is anything around faceted navigation and pagination, that you try to put that more into URL parameters rather than into the path. So with URL rewriting, you could put all of that into the path, but that makes it harder for us to recognize that this is actually part of faceted navigation, and maybe we can crawl it in a more optimized way. So things like faceted navigation, pagination, I definitely put into URL parameters. Also, if you have any kind of session IDs, definitely put that into parameters as well, rather than within the path.
Okay. May I
go
another
question? Sure.
We have a large-scale e-commerce site with mobile alternate, hreflang, so all the stuff that makes your life interesting. And it's about data consistency. We're having trouble to submit the data to Google in fast enough. For example, with sitemaps, we generate them, and by the time Google comes and sees it and crawls the page is on no index and generates errors. Does this have negative effects?
It doesn't really have negative effects that we think the rest of your site is bad, but obviously we won't have indexed those pages. So
yeah, that generates problem with hreflang text, for example. So you don't have it indexed. Unraveled from there.
Yeah, but if they're not indexed, then the hreflang tag doesn't need to do anything there. I think that's something where what I would try to figure out in a case like that is what you can do to optimize crawling in general, which could be to simplify the URL structure, to try to kind of exclude all of the pagination and the faceted navigation parts out, which could also be to think about what you can do to host on a faster platform so that crawling can be done a lot more faster, so that we don't run into the situation as often that you submit something, and by the time we get to it, you've completely changed what this page is about. So kind of improving the efficiency of crawling overall would be something that I try to look into there.
Okay, thanks.
But that's probably also one of the harder things to do. I think improving the efficiency of your URL structure internally, that's really tricky. But I think it makes a lot of sense to focus on that, especially if you're a really large website, because then you do see bigger effects. If you can exclude certain parameters and suddenly you have 1/10 of the URLs on your website, then that does make a big difference.
There's a question generally about SEM and SEO and how the lift works together. So when you spend more on SEM, does that also potentially affect your SEO rankings, where you now have high clicks because people see it at the top, they click through, and then it carries some page rank? Or is that separated out and you don't get the lift from some of the paid search? In other words, what's the interplay between them?
We treat them as separately as possible. So that's something where, from our point of view, it's really important that what we show in the organic search results is not affected by any kind of financial relationship that's in place. So whether or not you buy Google ads, that's totally up to you. That shouldn't affect at all how we show sites in search. So any kind of effect that you would see from people going to the ads and the ads getting high click-through rate and, I don't know, more visibility, maybe that's something that wouldn't have any effect at all on search. What of course can help there is if you're starting out and you're trying to kind of bring your name out there and people see your content and they're like, oh, this is really fantastic service, and they start recommending it because they saw it in some ads, which could be anywhere. It could be on TV. That's something that obviously indirectly could have an effect, but that's kind of like just normal marketing. It's not tied to any specific advertising that you're doing.
Well, another effect I believe happens is if a searcher sees an ad on top and then a listing either directly under or middle of the page, some people are more inclined to clicking on the organic than on the ad.
I have no idea. So that's possible that there are like usability studies like that.
Yeah, there was research in 2013 or something. Somebody internally in Google put something together.
And then even more recently, they had another one that came out. So originally, the latest one said it was 50% more if you're on the top and over 90% if in the middle.
I have no idea. So you're saying if you're ranking lower, you get more clicks?
Basically, if you have,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, interesting. And I did find that weird.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I have no idea. So I have no insight at all into the ad side at Google. We really try to keep that separate. Also, internally, when anyone from the ad side contacts us and says, oh, I have this really important client, and they're not going to buy any ads anymore unless we solve this SEO problem, we can't help them. That's something where we really need to say, well, this is a different part of Google. We want to make sure that the organic results are really independent of any financial relationship there. And we need to clearly say, well, they can come join the Hangouts, they can post in the help forum, they can use any of the other public channels, but we can't give them any special treatment.
With your own analysis, do you take into account if ads are there or not? For example, the effective click-through rate, and you might be using that to decide how good search results are. So do you kind of go, there's 3 ads above, things might be different?
I don't know. So as far as I know, we don't use that directly for search anyway. We do use kind of the user behavior as something when we analyze algorithms. So when we have different algorithms that we're trying out or different settings for algorithms, we try to figure out which one of these actually works better across millions of searches. And for this kind of A/B testing, I don't know what they would do specifically with regards to ads. I suspect they try to treat them just as organically as possible and say, well, some of these results have ads, some of them don't, and we need to kind of look at the bigger picture and look at it across really like millions and billions of searches to get like a real world feeling for that. That's not something that you can just look at one search results page and say, well, this is like this and this is like that. But it's interesting because the search team is running experiments all the time. It's something that they're like when you search, you're almost always in a number of experiments, which might be things like small pixel shifts in the search results, might be some subtle color changes. Sometimes it's subtle ranking differences. That's something that's run all the time. And it's in talking with these people, they sometimes have really surprising effects that they don't expect. So looking back, for example, when we started with the mobile-friendly label that we show in the search results, we tried different variations of like saying this is mobile-friendly or not mobile-friendly or showing icons or different colors. And we assumed that things like a green phone would be useful as a symbol rather than writing it out. And it turns out people were confused, or it took a certain amount of time for people to actually realize what this meant, that it's not like it will call someone on the phone, but rather it's suitable for your phone. And these were these are all things that you have to try out. So I think even any other website, you have to constantly be testing and trying things out, even things that you assume don't have any effect at all, or that you assume you know exactly what the effect will be, because sometimes it is surprising.
Sure.
So I do have another question. Last time I was in the meeting, we talked about the fact that we were seeing more Google-generated meta descriptions. And I have seen some examples of some pretty hard fails there. For example, a technical client that has a page with a ton of specs on it, we're now seeing in Google Search Console multiplications as a keyword that was matched to the page. Now, it doesn't matter, obviously, if someone clicks it, they won't go there, but it's obviously, when I go and I do a search for that query, I see the Google generated thing. It's just the numbers from the table, and it doesn't make sense. So where do I put the feedback for that?
You can submit it in the search results. On the bottom, there's a feedback link.
Right.
That's really useful.
Okay.
If there's something specific, especially if it's a bigger theme that you're seeing, not like one search results page that is bad, then that's something that could go into the help forum. That could be something that you could send me directly as well. Usually for both of those channels, it's not something that the search team would get back to you and say, oh, we tweaked this, or we found this bug, or we changed this, but rather they take this feedback and they try to use that to tune the algorithms for the future.
Right. And
that might be that they change those algorithms right away. It might be that like the next iteration that they do a year later, they take that into account.
And I'm fine. I'm fine not getting the feedback, but giving it in.
I think that's really useful. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
So that keyword density question I was mentioning earlier, right? Even large enterprise platforms that give advice professionally for SEO will say you should have X number of keywords of an instance on a page, and that's like a hard line. If it's 5,000 words, if it's 100 words on the page. And Matt Cutts had a video from 2011 where he says, that's not really how this works, right? But they still give this advice. Can you comment on, in 2018, is it basically the same thing as it was in 2011, and that's not the way to look at it?
Yeah, I wouldn't look at keyword density. I don't think that's a useful metric. What I would look at, though, is if you mention your keyword at all. So not necessarily one-to-one the exact keyword, but kind of like what people are searching for that you want your page to be found for, and that you at least mention that on those pages. That's kind of the level that I would look at there. So sometimes when we do site clinics, we see websites that are really fancy, really nice, but you look at them and you're like, what are they trying to offer? And like, what would they want to rank for? And you like, as a human, you can't figure it out. And that's the kind of situation where if you at least like say, well, we're, I don't know, a service provider for this, then at least search engines will be able to say, oh, yeah, a service provider and this topic that they're working on, that's a good thing to match this for. Whereas if there's just like, we're the best company for, I don't know, it's like in California for small businesses, and it's like, okay, what do you actually do? And maybe on the images, it's kind of clear what they do. But when we look at the text, if we don't have that at all, that's a bit of a problem. Especially, I think, with the higher end of small businesses, that's a problem because they have enough money to hire a graphic designer to actually make a website, but not enough to actually figure out what this website should be ranking for and what should be placed on the website.
Sorry.
Go for it. Yeah.
I have a question about the Search Console.
Sure.
So we found that there's a huge difference between the new beta and the old one, I guess we'll call it, in terms of the number of pages that we have indexed. It's like a 3x difference, the old one being higher. And that also doesn't match when we do like a site colon on our domain. So like, which one of those numbers is the most trustworthy in your opinion, and how fresh is it typically, that number?
How fresh? I don't know how quickly they update that data at the moment. I think it's something like weekly. I don't know. It might be that they're still kind of fine-tuning that. So the site query numbers are definitely numbers that that are more of an approximation than anything else. That's something that we really tune to be an approximation. So we try to get a number as quickly as possible, and that can be off by a factor of 10 or a factor of 100 even. So it's more like, well, you have a lot of pages or you don't have a lot of pages. The number in Search Console for the index status count, I think that's a lot closer. I'm not so sure of the differences with index status, with like the index composition. I think the new one that's called, what the differences there would be. The most exact one that I would use is a sitemaps index count. That's something that's updated immediately. That's like on a day-to-day basis, we look at what is actually indexed based on what you submitted, which I think is a useful way to look at it, because we index a lot of pages that you don't really care about, and those would be counted in the graphs, but that's not really something that you care about. Like we found, I don't know, in infinite calendar on your site, and suddenly you have 1 million pages indexed more. It's like, well, that's not going to bring any traffic, because nobody's going to search for like events in 2,500. Right. It's like.
Yeah. Quick question about, we're talking about fresh data. This is a little bit off the topic, but in Google Keyword Planner, do you know how often the search volume data is updated? There's a lot of varying opinions on this online, but I can't get an answer to that. Because obviously new keywords are in there, right? But like, how often are they refreshing data for existing keywords?
I have no idea.
I don't know.
I think that's run by the AdWords team. So
right. I figured it was a long shot.
Like, yeah, I have no idea.
I'll keep looking.
Yeah.
Let me know when you find it.
Yeah.
All right. I think we're like way over time. So it's been good having you all here. It's good having you all stick around until way late. So yeah.
It's our pleasure, gentlemen.
You guys are crazy.
We just love Google and SEO.
Yes. And
cool.
Our wives will kill us.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be a shame. All right, so let's take a break here. Thank you all for joining. I'll set up the next Hangouts probably, I don't know, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, so that if there are any questions that need to be answered as well, you can add those there. And as always, you're welcome to post in the forum or tweet us on Twitter and try to get answers there as well. All right, thanks again, and see you next time.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.